Hello and welcome to the Sierra Bible Church Sermon of the Week. We hope you enjoy this message by Pastor Nathan Levering.
Well, it's great to be here. And I love the words of that song, right? It's this incredible picture that God looked at humanity and said, I'm going to do something about that mess. And we've probably all at different times taken our own kind of role and thought, what would I have done if I were in God's shoes, right? And certainly there's a sense of like, I'm not sure I'd have done anything for people like me, and yet God did. He surrendered his life. He gave everything on a cross so that you could have your present and eternity changed forever. And so we're a place that wants to get that message out as far as we can. You can know Jesus. You can be restored in relationship with him because of what he's done to change everything. And it's that sort of idea of seeing a need, stepping into it with a sense of maybe God is inviting me to play a part that we're going to walk through, as Jason alluded to, in a series. Really, it's kind of the kickoff to a season, we hope, here at Sierra Bible Church that we're calling Built to Belong. You'll see this branding kind of all over the place. We're going to hand you a very well-made booklet like this with some other pieces to it on your way out. And it's really, it's sort of the next step for us as we believe God is stirring us to some particular opportunities in our community, in our time, to make a difference. In order to kind of walk this out, we're going to use the book of Nehemiah. On Sundays, we won't get to go through it verse by verse. It's an amazing narrative. I'd encourage you on your own study, on your own time. It's not a real long book to dive into it, but we'll be able to piece it together because we're going to look at a man that some of us know. He is a Jewish man in exile in a place called Persia, the capital city of Susa. And it's really the journey of a guy who gets his heart broken by God, sees a need, and he sort of walks into that need with open hands. God affirms what he stirred in him to a point of what we're going to call and see as faith-filled sacrificial conviction. A place of risking everything, a place of stepping in with all that he has. And then we'll watch God do what only God can do. And in many ways, this is what we're asking him to do and us to be a part of here at Sierra Bible Church in this season we are calling Built to Belong. It's kind of an all-church, all-in campaign. And in some ways, we're bringing this vision that God's given us before God's people and saying, is God in this? We believe he is. We're at this place of saying he's moved, he's stirred. What would it look like for us, church, to stand into our time in our place? As I said, the book of Nehemiah, if you have a Bible, I'll encourage you to open it. We'll spend some time reading in chapter 2 and a couple verses from chapter 1, but we'll be in the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah is in exile when we start the story, and he is actually, it's 444 BC, so a few hundred years before Jesus shows up. Nehemiah is in exile. He actually has a pretty good job. It's called a cupbearer. This would have been a person that tastes the wine, and in huge sort of kingdoms like the kingdom of Persia, this was actually a pretty good gig. You weren't necessarily, tasting wine that might have been poisoned. You're actually celebrating and really living with the king. And he is doing that with a guy we know as King Artaxerxes I. And so Nehemiah's got this pretty great job, but he's some 500 miles from his homeland. And as a Jew, God begins to kind of stir his heart. Back up. Our stories, like his stories, have all kinds of context. Think with me for a moment about the last time you were sort of confronted with the reality that something needs to change. That was nice. Right? Do you have it in your mind? When was it time? I mean, for me, one of those times, Kathy and I were hosting a life group in our home, And there was this couple, they would sit down. This is one of those, I knew that something needed to change because I watched somebody else live life and I thought, they've got something I want. Have you ever had this happen? And it's like, I'd like to live the life they're living. So there's this couple that comes in, like all the other couples, I think they're just normal like the rest of us. And instead, what I notice is as soon as the wife starts sharing in life group, the husband is just like, touching her hands, he's got his hand on her neck. He's just very affectionate. And he's just like, oh, wow. And he's just loving his wife with so much affection. And I'm like, I hate you right now. But I want to learn how to do that. And I remember telling Kathy, how this one particular couple, he's so affectionate. She's like, yeah, wouldn't that be amazing? And she's sort of chiding me, which happens when we step out. I'm like, I want to do that. And so I try occasionally, and she makes fun of me. So we're kind of trying still after, 20, almost 30 years, figuring it out. But you look at times we watch somebody live life and we think, something ought to change. There are other times where we sort of pray what Nehemiah will eventually pray, this sort of prayer of awareness. It's that time where we're confronted with the blessing we have. With, okay, it's hard. And okay, I lost power again last night, but let's be honest. God, look at what we have. What do you want with this? What do you want with what you've given me? What are you asking me to do in this world for you? It's sort of just open my eyes to be aware. There are those other times where we kind of hit the proverbial wall. And all of us have done this in different ways, right? I mean, sometimes it's sort of just not, real kind of one of those things where you're putting your pants on and you're like, okay, I can't even button these things anymore. Something needs to change. Sometimes we maybe snap at our kids and we think in that moment, why is my kid the recipient of my stress? Something needs to change of all kinds of different ways. And God comes to Nehemiah at this point and breaks his heart and invites him to be a part of his change in the world. We think God's doing this around here at Sierra Bible Church. And so in this story, Nehemiah is in, as we said, Persia, but he has a story that got him there. So if you know the nation of Israel and their story, let's just backtrack. This is about the previous 300 years. The nation of Israel is doing pretty good. Like you sometimes and like me, when we're doing pretty good, we start thinking we're pretty cool. I'm not sure we need God anymore. You ever have a faith like that? It's like, man, my faith was really strong when I was being drugged through and Israel's kind of like that too. All of a sudden, they mistake, like we can, God's blessing for their sort of pride and arrogance. And God does what he does. He puts them in timeout. And so for a number of different times, the nation of Israel is put in timeout. So around 720 BC, the nation of Assyria comes in and conquers them. A couple hundred years after that, the nation of Babylon comes in and conquers them. When Babylon conquers they actually take the best and brightest, right? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Some of you know these names. The person of Daniel. This is when Babylon took the Jews out of Jerusalem, out of the nation, out of the area of Judea, and took them to Babylon, right? And so this is when they sort of get into exile, which is where, again, we pick up the story of Nehemiah. Persia eventually comes in and conquers Babylon, and Persia is, of course, where we find Nehemiah. Now, for about 90 years, the nation of Persia has ruled this particular corner of the world. Now, what Persia did under the Emperor Cyrus is this. Said to all the Jews that are dispersed throughout this area, hey, you guys are free to go home. When we read these stories of the Jews returning home, we see that their hearts are just broken and they weep because the place is a mess. What was once Solomon's temple, the pride of all the nations, we're told in that time, is now completely gone because Babylon, as a result of Israel's arrogance, just destroyed it. So they cobbled together a little bit of a place of worship. But we're at this place where a number of the Jews have returned the 500-mile journey from Susa in Persia up to Jerusalem. Now, as we pick up the story in Nehemiah chapter 1, Nehemiah again is the cupbearer of the king, and he gets a visit from his brother, as well as a bit of an entourage with a little bit of, hey, here's what's going on in Jerusalem. So when he visits, if we pick up the story in chapter 1, verse 3, after Nehemiah asked his brother, well, how is it going? Here's what we read. They said to me, this is Nehemiah speaking, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. Now for us, it's kind of like, well, that's kind of a bummer. But for them, this meant a whole list of things that were core to who they were and the ability to rebuild that. For them, they understood that who they were was tied to who God was. And they knew God, and this breaks his heart. Who they were, we can kind of summarize in these three statements. They're a people in whom are scattered and without identity. They have no way to come together because the walls are torn down and Jerusalem's a mess and have any kind of identity. They do not belong in this area. The families and the community are increasingly insecure. It's as if all the doors have been taken off the bedrooms and it's fair game, right? Everything is a mess. What we'll find out as we continue to read the story is that the nation of Israel, those who were trying to sort of cobble together life and worship again in Jerusalem, are constantly being taken advantage from those within Jerusalem and those outside. The other thing that we'll begin to read is that the word of God is being diluted into culture. Anytime there are no walls, anytime there is no ability to gather, what we begin to see is just this hodgepodge of pagan culture and the truth of God's word. And so this is what Nehemiah understands when his brother says they're in trouble and great distress, which prompts Nehemiah's response. Because what Nehemiah then does at this point is come before the Lord. What I want to do is stop us for a second and maybe take us back to that place in your own life where you thought something needs to change. Because this is sort of a tenuous point in your story of transformation. It's after we've been stirred to the reality that something needs to change that all kinds of little things come in. The first thing that we're tempted by is distraction, especially in our world. Right? It's just the chaos, the noise, the busyness. And we probably thought, this needs to change. I need to take this step. I should go talk to my wife. Instead, I'm just going to scroll. See how my fantasy football team did. I'm going to do whatever it is. We just get distracted, right? At least if you're living in the same world that I'm living in. The second thing that can happen is when that comes, we can say, I've tried that before. And we just sort of there's no possible way God could be asking me to do that. Have you ever had that? Put yourself in Nehemiah's shoes for a minute. Some 500 miles. He has a job you just can't quit from. You don't quit if you work for the king. He employs you for the rest of your life. And so for sure, Nehemiah had to sort of have this sense of, I can't believe this is happening, but I can't do anything about it, just sort of defeated. And then some of us, it's sort of the opposite swing of that pendulum. When we know that there's change to be had and we might be being asked to play a part, we just jump in and try and fix the problem. Any of you out there that are like me? You don't really need to think about it. You don't need to plan. I was talking to a guy not too long ago, and he's like, man, I'm starving. I'm like, why are you so hungry? I'm trying to lose weight. Well, what's your plan? I'm starving. I just told you. Like, I know, what's your plan? He's like, I'm just going to starve myself until I lose the weight. I'm like, I can identify with some of that. I got a problem. I'm just going to fix it. Let's fix it now. We'll move on, right? And yet we know, right? We might get some short-term success, but long-term change will elude us. And so we see and are modeled what Nehemiah does next. In verse 4, of chapter 1, Nehemiah says this, when I heard these things, when I sensed God stirring, I sat down. I didn't go charge the gates. I didn't rally anything. I just sat down and wept. I was broken before God. For some days, he says, I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Probably very much with the sense that I can't do this. But very much a sense that God was stirring him to make change. And this is what, if you read his prayer, it's those next few verses. We're not going to look at it this morning. But this is really what he prays. It's a prayer of awareness and confession. He asked these two questions. What in the world did we do to get here? And for them, that was a list. It was a number of things, negative choices they had made to get them to this place where God finally wakes him up and says, it's time for change. The second thing he prays is this: what do you want me to do? And what do you want me to do right now? What are you asking me to do right now? So that distraction doesn't take place, so that I don't eventually find a different plan or a different way. I know you've broken my heart to your needs. I will act now. I want to pick up the story then in chapter 2, verse 1, halfway through verse 1. And Nehemiah, as the cupbearer of the king, with a broken heart, as we'll see, begins to serve the king. And then the king and he get into an amazing little conversation. So in verse 1 of chapter 2, we pick it up right here where Nehemiah says this: I took the wine and gave it to the king. And then an interesting picture of what's going on inside him as well as outside. I had not, Nehemiah says, been sad in his presence before. So the king, seeing my sadness, leans in and asks me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. Now, the next few words give us a picture into what is really happening in this question, at least what Nehemiah thinks is happening. Because here's what he says, the next 5 words: I was very much afraid. I mean, this is that point where the stirring of God is about to go public. This is that place where the change that God is asking Nehemiah to do is starting to move from this conviction that God's given him to putting it out in front of other people. This is that place for what could just be put back on the back burner, all of a sudden turns into risk and challenge. I mean, I love this, it's sort of even become this saying for some of us churchy kinds of people. When we say, this was just a time I got out of the boat. What we mean by that is in Matthew 15, there was a time when the disciples are rowing the boat and Jesus comes walking across the lake and they start this interesting discussion. Is that Jesus? That can't be Jesus. There's no way. And they think it's a ghost, right? And as Jesus comes closer, they kind of yell out to him. And Peter, in fact, says, if that's you, Jesus, and you remember what he says? He's like, call me out onto the water. And it's at that point that Peter does what Nehemiah is being confronted with here. He actually steps out onto the water. Will this hold me? And it's this place that so many of us get to. The picture, right, of all these people just kind of sitting in the boat, except Peter. And we know that God's brought us up to all kinds of change. And so few of us actually move. And so in the midst of this fear, listen to how Nehemiah responds with faith. Verse 3, but I said to the king, this is always a good place to start. May the king live forever. Then he goes on, he says, why should my face not look sad when the city where my fathers are buried lies in ruins and its gates have been destroyed? And the king said to me, what is it you want? And then he takes this sort of spiritual, almost out loud gulp before he answers the next question. And he says this in verse 4, then I prayed to the God of heaven. Like, I knew this next phrase could literally cost me my life. Like, this could cost me everything. What if God doesn't hold me? The other people are going to be laughing at me when I'm trying to figure out how to swim and get back on the boat. Oh, look at Peter. What an idiot. This is that moment. And God invites him out of sort of this place of wonder into conviction. Nehemiah, after praying to God, he answers the king. If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in his sight, let him send me to the city in Judah where my fathers are buried so that I may rebuild it. This is that moment of conviction. All of us guys that have ever bought a wedding ring know a little bit of what this feels like. Well, I'm buying it in faith. I'm not there yet, and Nehemiah steps into this place and asks of the king if he can go, if he can leave his service, if he can go do something about this. And fast forward into the story throughout chapter 2, his king, Artaxerxes, says, you can absolutely go. And then he leans into Nehemiah and he says, what do you need? And Nehemiah's, well, since you asked, I need all the supplies to rebuild this wall in this city. And it's 500 miles through a lot of kind of challenging territory. And if you would, king, in your own writing, kind of like write out some permission slips for me so that when I get to certain places, they'll know that I have your authority as we pass through these. And he's like, and I need stuff to kind of carry everything. And the king says, whatever you need, go. Oh, by the way, can you please come back? But go. And he sends him, commissions him as actually the governor of Judea to be the one in charge when Nehemiah gets home. And he steps into God's blessing. Picture this with me for a minute, because I love this picture. Here's the cupbearer of the king. He's a slave. He gets stirred by God to a point of faith-filled conviction that could, especially if he goes public with it, cost him everything. But God's involved. But God is working on the heart of this king in ways that this should not happen. And so as he rolls out of Susa, he rolls out like the king. And can you imagine running into Nehemiah? I mean, he's got all the supplies. He's got all the money he needs. He's got the papers. He's the governor, for crying out loud, of Judea on behalf of the king. And I mean, if you bumped into Nehemiah, what do you think his story's going to be? Yeah, I'm the cupbearer. I don't know. I just asked the king. I think he's kind of going crazy. You should go ask the king for something you want, because he's giving out stuff right now. I mean, it would be hard pressed for Nehemiah to think, yeah, I'm pretty great. Yeah, I got it together. Yeah, I've served the king. Now it's time for him to serve me. No, he saw God work. It's the same thing Peter said. I mean, if you know Peter's story, he fell in the water. He had to Jesus helped him swim in. But I guarantee you, it wasn't about the fact that he fell in the water after that. It was the fact that he stood on the water with Jesus. And here goes Nehemiah rolling out with all the excuses in his mind, but God. And Nehemiah shouts to us through the ages and says, I don't know what you're facing right now, but factor God in. I love the last song. I mean, what incredible imagery of the God of creation that steps in to our story and invites us to live it with him. We really believe that right now we're entering a season at Sierra Bible Church in which God is asking us to take these steps of faith-filled, sacrificial conviction. And now as we kind of go public with what we're going to do for the next 20 minutes or so together with this sort of vision that God's given us, I want to understand too out loud that some of you maybe are here for the first time and you're like, man, I just thought why did we talk about this building and what God is doing? And I hope you would leave maybe going, I'm not sure what they're doing, but God's at work. And that's a group of people that believes God for something. And just ask questions and begin to see if God might be stirring your heart to be a part of what we sense him doing in our future together. As Jason said, we're calling this Built to Belong. We really believe that God has us on kind of an amazing journey as we build out into his plan. Now, this always starts for us with our mission. Our mission around here at Sierra Bible Church is to know Jesus as we started to make him known. If you were around here a few weeks ago, we celebrated 50 years of God's alignment really to that vision, to being a place, a bunch of crazy people that are, in many ways shouldn't be the object of God's love, but find ourselves loved by him, coming together to know him. And then with that, not sort of stagnant in that, but to saying he's called us to make him known to our community and to the nations. Let's do that together. On our 50th year, we celebrated in a number of ways God's done that. We looked back to this first 10 families that started Sierra Bible Church, and they started with kind of an interesting conviction. Their conviction was something like this: we don't want to ever build any buildings at Sierra Bible Church. Like, we don't need any buildings. Why? Because we want to fund the mission. And now they broke that commitment shortly after because they had kids and they needed a place for their kids to go, and God was blessing. What they came to realize is sometimes the buildings serve the mission, and we really believe we're at that place again this morning. But as you know, because you drove on this beautiful campus, many of you dropped your kids off in an amazing kids building down here. You walked through this phenomenal commons area and you came and you sat in a gym for church. This is not the first time Sierra Bible Church has been in this place. This is not the first time God has looked at people like us and said, I want you to make a difference for generations to come. We, in many ways, are that generation. Our kids are those generations that other people stepped up and they stepped into God's plan. And we believe he's asking us to do that again in a very specific way. And we're going to try and roll some of that out. And so some of it's come from this question that Nehemiah asked, what needs to change? So I just want to take us through these three places that we've spent a lot of time and a lot of prayer. The first one is with regards to our students and the reality of student culture now. And we could do a deep dive on that this morning. We will not. But is this, that students are more connected than ever, but they feel more disconnected than ever. We believe at Sierra Bible Church, we are a place that wants to address that. We want to create a real place for students to belong, to be known, to grow in relationships, and that's a big part of where we sense God moving us forward. We want to say to the students of Sierra Bible Church and our community, you belong right here. You have a place to belong no matter what you believe, no matter where you're at, you belong here. Second, we believe that we live in a community that is a multi-generational community. I think most of us love where we live. If you don't, let's talk after the service. I mean, this is an amazing place. It's a multi-generational community, but it has very few healthy spaces for our community to connect and play. And you've probably all been in some version of a conversation that went something like this. Yeah, I love our community, but like, where do you go? Are there any parks here? Are there any places that are healthy and safe for people to gather? And we've just kind of decided we're not going to be people that complain about that, but maybe we could do something about it. And then lastly, our SBC value of connection and growth is frustrated by the flow and function of our campus. And the previous one, we're really trying to ask this question, what does it look like to turn our property and our facilities inside out for our community? And this last one, the question is this: how do we turn our current facility right side up for our church? And we've asked this question: if we had known back then what we now know, what would we have done different? And so we're going to make a few changes, plan changes to our facility. These sort of needs to change have caused us to ask three questions quickly. The first one is this: what resources would unleash our ability to fulfill these goals? What would move the needle for us? How is our church uniquely positioned to serve our community? And then lastly, as I alluded, if we had known then when we first came on this campus, I mean, has anyone in here ever wondered, why does the kids building face and open up to a big gravel parking lot? That just seems weird. Well, that's because we had different plans when we moved here. We didn't know yet who we were and how that would work on this campus. And so part of our build-out plan, which you'll see in the booklet that you'll get on the way out, is actually flipping Promised Land so that it opens to this side of the campus, the main hub of connection being out here in the Commons. These are some of the thinkings that have moved us forward. Well, there's sort of four main areas, and really these are broken into two phases. The first one and everything else right now, and you'll see why. But this is our Built to Belong plan that we are moving into together. The first is an 8,000 square foot student ministries building, also a multi-purpose building. As Jason will take us through the building in just a few minutes, you'll see some classrooms in there that we intend to use for Sunday morning adult education, as well as lots of different opportunities. Things like our Celebrate Recovery will be in there. It'll be like every building on this property, a multi-purpose, but it will primarily be built to say to the students that are at our church and in our community, you belong here. It'll have a student ministries focus. Another thing that God is opening us up to as we ask him, what does it look like to turn this beautiful 20 plus acre campus inside out for our community, is to develop some community gathering spaces. Some of you probably played our disc golf course. It's by those that play it, they'll say it's by far the most played disc golf course in our county. There's tons of people out there this morning. I always laugh I kind of prepare out here, and I always see guys before church playing disc golf, and it's like, cool, these guys are at our church. I hope they get a little bit of God's grace while they're throwing their discs. But we've developed a paved walking path out here in our beautiful area, so check those out. We also think that the addition of a splash pad and a turf field out on our campus that would be open to our community in all kinds of hours would be an amazing opportunity to say to our community, you belong here. We also then, as I mentioned previously, have plans around this idea of church family connecting spaces. And that is that we would change the way the entrance to Promised Land works. We'd open up some classrooms in the back. All of these, as well as we need an admin building. It would also house our food pantry and some library things. We've got a vision for that. But as of now, that's sort of further down the list since we put a roof on it. Prior to the roof, it was higher on the list. I don't know if any of you visited in the last year or so, but when it rained outside, it rained inside. So we would wrap, some of you guys have buildings like this too. We'd wrap our computers in trash cans or trash bags, before we left for the weekend. We think we're better now, but that's part of it. Phase one, to move this forward, is a $2.7 million building and parking lot improvements. And so we're going to invite you at the conclusion of this service to make your way out this door or this door, but to get out there and stand in the plot of land that is marked off for our student ministries building. You'll see some signs out there. You can go get a cup of coffee. Not really. You can go use the bathroom. Not really. But they're marked out there so you can kind of see them. So we're just inviting you before you run off and get distracted to spend a minute in those rooms and just see what we sense God is asking us to move into. With phase one, it comes with a big roundabout here. The roadway that accesses Bluebell will be moved. It'll be moved up to this end of the property, and parking lot spaces will be put in all in the back. It's kind of a cool layout. There's a roundabout, since those are cool in Sonora right now. But it just creates open, safe drop-offs for people of all ages right out here. And so it's a cool thing. We've been working with, some of you know these people, Mark Patterson down at California Gold, Joe Plume at Plum Construction, and we are really close to having our building plans in hand and being pretty much ready to go with regards to all of our approvals through the county. We hope there's county people in here. You heard that. We're close. But then the future development we see as a $1.4 million with our community spaces, kids building, and our admin building. Okay. Why the focus on the youth building? I want to give you just a couple of these things really quickly. The first is, have you been to our youth buildings? That kind of answers it. They're in tough shape. They were old portables when we got them. We've used them for many, many, many years, and they're done. So they're falling apart. There's holes in them. The roof's falling. We had to do something. As well as if you came on our campus last Sunday night or Monday night, you would have been greeted by insane amounts of chaos because there were over 160 students between our 5th, 6th program up through our high school students, as well as over 25, 30 leaders on our campus that are in and out of these portables and beating them to death. And so that's a part of why we are moving things forward. This building will have an amazing big space for worship and also a small group emphasis, as you'll see in a minute. The second thing is that drop-off is crazy, especially when it's dark. And so if you were to drop off a new student, we get lots of new students here because our programs are phenomenal and parents are looking for opportunities for their kids. They drop them off, and if it's dark, they have to get from somehow out here to wherever we're meeting up there. And it just says sort of the opposite of this whole you belong here thing. And so we shuffle them up into the dark, and we want to change that. And many of us, because we're raising kids, we know that the current cultural challenges for kids to connect in real ways are more abundant than ever. And then lastly, for the last 50 years, and I've been here for a lot of these years. I grew up, I was a student in this ministry. I had the privilege of coming back as a youth pastor. We have housed our student ministries in buses, in sheds. We've bussed them down to sheds. We've done them in portables, as we've said. We've done it in kids ministry. Our first little 1,400 square foot house, we ripped a wall out between two of our bedrooms, and we did student ministries in our house for a season. And we're done. Not to say houses don't make great, but we're sort of done shuttling our kids out back or across the street. And we believe God is asking us to do something about that. And if you go walk on this and you can begin to envision the picture of a greeting space out here that's connected to this building. If you were here the day after Hume and this place was packed with students worshiping, we so desire to say to the kids of our community, you belong here. You are not out back until you get old enough to come in. You are a part of what God is doing. And so that's all a part of this vision that we sense God moving us into.
Thanks so much for joining us, church. We hope that you enjoyed this message. If you'd like to hear more messages like this, or if you'd like to consider partnering with us financially, please visit sierrabible.com.